Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is David Childry, and here we have Brandon Rogers and Darius White with Motif Debate. Welcome to our first Motif Debate demo debate. Thank you for joining us tonight. As far as these two debaters we have with us tonight, Brandon Rogers is on the affirmative side, and in high school he made it to NSDA Nationals all 4 years in policy, extemp, PF, and Congress, and he also has extensive LD experience. And then on the next side, we have Darius White. This is Darius, and debating for the University of Oklahoma, he won the CX Debate Association Championship and has won 3 national tournaments that same year already. So we've got some great debaters debating for you today, and you can see on the screen right here in the middle that the topic is our current September-October topic. In the United States, colleges and universities ought not consider standardized tests in undergraduate admissions decisions. So during the debate, as you're watching, you can type in your questions, and I may type back a reply right away, or I may wait until the end of the debate to answer it for everyone, depending on the nature of the question. And as we get started, for those of you who are first-time debaters, or especially if this is the first debate round you ever have watched, try to listen for and identify the main arguments for this first speech. You'll notice that both debaters will start with a pre-written speech that they've already done, they researched and typed up in advance. That's called their case. And every Lincoln Douglas debate round starts with the affirmative. Between each speech, I'll give you a quick little information on what to expect next, or maybe answer some questions along the way if there are some. And with that said, let's get started with our first speech, which is from Brandon on the affirmative.
All right. I affirm the resolution. In the United States, colleges and universities ought not consider standardized testing in undergraduate admissions. I offer the following definitions from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Colleges and universities: an independent institution of higher learning offering a course of general studies leading to a bachelor's degree. Ought, moral obligation. Consider, to think about carefully. Standardized tests: tests that are given in a consistent or standard manner. Standardized tests are designed to have consistent questions, administrative procedures, and scoring procedures. My value is justice, defined as fairness. The standard for this value is minimizing structural violence. Structural violence is based on moral exclusion of certain groups from society, including racial, ethnic, or gender minorities. Those excluded groups do not receive a voice in moral, political, and social discourse. Winter and Leighton 99 write, "To recognize structural violence forces us to ask questions about how and why we tolerate it, questions which often have painful answers for the privileged elite who unconsciously support it. Our normal cognitive processes divide people into in-groups and out-groups. Those outside lie outside our scope of justice. Injustice is barely noticed if it occurs to those who are invisible. Those who fall outside are morally excluded. Structural violence is not inevitable if we become aware of it and build systematic ways to mitigate its effects. My thesis and sole contention is that standardized tests negatively impact marginalized students." Subpoint A, standardized tests are racially biased. According to Au and 18, in the Santa Clara Law Review, there were trial SAT questions where Black and Latino students got the right answer more often than whites. These questions were deemed invalid as real questions for the use of future tests. The SAT denies the existence of structural issues and instead posits that the issue is about individual effort. Remedies for educational inequality being pushed by corporate education reformers are grit and resilience. Additionally, Hampshire College found that after removing standardized test scores, their diversity increased. According to Lash and 15, class diversity increased to 31% students of color, up from 21% 2 years ago. The percentage of students who are first generation from their family to attend college rose from 12% to 18% in this year's class. Subpoint B, standardized tests further class disparities. According to Olson and 15, students who can afford expensive study aids to improve their scores have an advantage over students without the money. The more money a student puts into preparing for the SAT, the more equipped the student is with knowledge for succeeding. Ultimately, the SAT becomes a test biased towards those who have more wealth over those who cannot afford to buy prep resources. The National Center for Fair and Open Testing studied the College Board's 2014 test score data and found an overall 400-point gap between the wealthiest and poorest families. The more money a student has for SAT prep, the more insight and game knowledge he or she has to master its tricks. The College Board requires a $52.50 test fee, yet another monetary requirement unfair to those not able to pay for numerous retakes to achieve a desired score. Subpoint C. Standardized tests discriminate against English second language students. Ershova writes in 2017 that an exchange student or a recent immigrant may be extremely bright, but their standardized test scores would not display that. Due to a lack of English skills, a standardized test would portray them as below average. Now, there are two impacts to this marginalization. The first impact is that having the opportunity to attain higher education is a crucial indication of future quality of life. According to Pew Research in 2014, on virtually every measure of economic well-being and career attainment, from personal earnings to job satisfaction to share employed full-time, young college graduates are outperforming their peers with less education. College graduates earn more annually, are more likely to be employed full-time, and significantly less likely to be unemployed. These benefits outweigh the financial burden imposed by 4 or more years of college. About 9 in 10 with at least a bachelor's degree say college has already paid off or will pay off in the future. The explanation for this lies in the dramatic decline in the value of a high school's education. While earnings of those with a college degree rose, the typical high school graduate earnings fell. The second impact is that standardized tests result in mental health distress, such as anxiety surrounding school, to students that are targeted by them. According to Walpole in 2005, African American and Latino high school students struggle with the anxiety of taking the SAT. They historically and currently score lower on standardized tests. These lower test scores are a persistent barrier to pursuing post-secondary education for African American and Latino students, particularly those from low-income urban areas. Achieving scores high enough to get into college put a great deal of pressure on students, one said. The SAT made her feel incompetent. And minorities further feel pressured to not conform to negative stereotypes. According to Thames in 2013, stereotype threat has demonstrated to negatively affect certain racial and ethnic groups when they become hyper-aware that their performance could conform to the stereotype that they wish to avoid. The pressure to not conform creates anxiety, which in turn can affect performance. And stress and anxiety hurt students' academic performance, which creates a vicious cycle. According to Fulton in 2016, not only does test anxiety lead to school failure, but also to poor self-esteem and stress-related physical ailments. Students with test anxiety have difficulty organizing their thoughts or reading and understanding the test questions. They may do poorly on the exam even though they know the material. Stress that is not treated can lead to poor academic performance, emotional issues, misbehavior, and even more serious issues such as drug use, health issues, and even suicide. And it is for these reasons that I affirm.
So you probably noticed that he started with definitions, and then he had a value of justice and a standard of minimizing structural violence. And then his sole contention was the bulk argument of structural violence that happens as a result of this standardized testing. The next period we have is cross-examination. There'll be 2 cross-examinations. The first one, the negative, asks questions to the affirmative, and the affirmative simply answers them. Later, the second cross-examination period will be the opposite, and the affirmative will be asking, the negative will be answering. Are you both ready for cross-ex?
Yes.
Yes, we are.
Okay, so cross-ex 3 minutes starts now.
If the negative wins, then eliminating standardized testing actually increases the negative effects on marginalized students. Does the negative win the debate?
Yes, the negative would, although I don't think you're going to prove that.
Okay, your second piece of evidence says that first-generation students the amount of first-generation students in college has actually increased from 12% to 18%. If that is true, then what is the negative impact on, I guess, marginalized students, standardized testing has caused?
A particular piece of evidence is talking about a university that stopped using standardized testing as a kind of standard for entrance into the school.
Could you repeat me the line, and do you know what school did this?
Yes, this was Hampshire College, and it was the percentage of students who are the first generation from their family to attend college rose from 12% to 18% in this year's class. And that was in the context of that particular school after implementing this policy.
Is it just a one-year study, or is it a multi-year study?
I believe that it's a 2-year study.
Okay, then. You have another piece of evidence that says that the standardized tests that are utilized for college admission discriminate against people that don't use English as their first language. I guess, does the affirmative get rid of all tests then?
No, the affirmative only gets rid of tests that are standardized.
I guess then, how does the affirmative get rid of anxiety or mental health issues that second, I guess, English speakers have whenever they are taking other tests?
Sure, these may apply to other tests in some ways, but in standardized tests, it demands a certain level of English comprehension, especially those vocabulary sections and writing where it necessarily puts more pressure. If I can ask you
another question, why is that unique to standardized testing? Because I think that your impact is predicated upon eliminating the cycle of mental health and anxiety. I guess, how does eliminating standardized testing eliminate that cycle?
It wouldn't eliminate the cycle completely, but standardized testing is an important area where this occurs that we can eliminate.
I guess, where in your piece of evidence does it say that standardized testing is uniquely key to mental health issues in, I guess, secondary education or in high school education?
I'm not exactly sure what you're looking for.
I guess my question is, how does eliminating standardized testing eliminate the cycle of mental health issues? Which is your impact?
I never claimed to eliminate the cycle of mental health issues completely, just that standardized testing is one way that these manifest themselves and that we should get rid of that.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so next we'll have the first negative speech. And in this speech, you'll notice that the first part of Darius's speech will be his case. And then he will transition into rebuttal, where he also responds to the arguments that Brandon already made. This is called the negative constructive, but it also includes the first negative rebuttal. Darius, would you like some prep time?
Yes. May I have some prep time?
Yes, just let me know when to stop it.
Okay.
So if you notice on the screen on the far right in the center, I started Darius's prep time. Each debater in Lincoln Douglas has 4 minutes of prep time, and you can use it in small increments as you please between speeches throughout the round. So you may use 2 minutes of prep time before your first speech, and then you may use another minute before cross-ex, and then maybe another minute before your final speech. Each kid is free to choose how they divide it and when they use it.
And I actually think I am ready for my negative case.
Okay, great. Ready when you are.
My roadmap will be the negative constructive and the affirmative constructive. In the negative constructor, I will also be addressing my opponent's framework as well. All right, I'm ready. I agree with my opponent's framework, both their value and their value criteria, but I will definitely disagree with the fact that eliminating standardized testing actually resolves any of the negative impact that the affirmative has created. Firstly, alternative admission models such as grade inflation means that standardized tests are preferable to any other current metric of undergrad acceptance. That's Buckley in 2018. Grade inflation in high school have been on the rise for 20 years, while SAT scores have remained steady. These trends especially pronounced among students at affluent white high schools. The idea that relying heavily on grades will reduce inequities in the admissions process seems implausible. And Standardized tests ensure stability by countering grade inflation and other arbitrary high school practices. It is the only method that is able to solve for inequalities the best. That's DuBois in 2018. People who believe in inequality champion standardized tests. They serve as the bulwarks against the pernicious effects of high school grade inflation. It's the sign of the continued degradation of educational standards. High school grades are inflated at a rapid pace unequally from 1998 to 2016. The average high school GPA rose from 3.7 or 3.27 to 3.38, distributed over millions of students as a large increase. The phenomenon is concentrated at the top. Even measures like class rank fail to distinguish grades, as high schools vary widely in how grades are weighted and do not make this info public to colleges. Some high schools now graduate over 100 students named valedictorians. And grade inflation exacerbates wealth and race inequalities more than anything else in the school system, which deters less privileged students from entering selective universities. It's getting worse, and this in turns the affirmative case that only means that they make their impacts worse. That's DuBois and 2. Grade inflation perpetuates traditional inequalities. The problem is rampant in private schools, where grades are inflating at 3 times the rate of public schools. Private schools have a direct financial incentive to please parents in a way public schools do not. White affluent parents likely enjoy greater capital and thus greater ability to pressure teachers. Privileged poor and minority parents largely lack. The incentives for teachers of wealthy white students only become more obvious as the race to the top gets more intense. And eliminating standardized testing exacerbates systematic biases in admission processes. Prefer this piece of evidence as it takes into account all of the inequalities that their evidence takes into account and provides comparative studies between a world with standardized tests and a world without it. That's Meltzer's in 2018. If the ACT and the SAT were abolished, would the result be a fairer system? Probably not. Socioeconomic factors underlie so many aspects of the admissions process that eliminating testing would do little. An admission process devoid of SAT, ACT scores would be much more reliant on transcript. But well-off students have access to more advanced classes and also have higher grades. Tutoring is not limited to standardized testing. Grades, unlike test scores, can be affected by purely subjective measures such as extra credit and parental willingness to lobby. Then there's the essay, the area most ripe for help that crosses the line. In the absence of test scores, it would be taking on additional weight. Admission offers cannot tell whether applicants' work is truly theirs. The corollary to application inflation would be undoubtedly increase if scores were no longer a requirement, is enrollment instability. And school needs to protect their yield. One way colleges accomplish this is to accept larger percentages of their applicants. Early decision of practice that benefits advantaged applicants. Privileged applicants are also advantaged by attending schools that have a history of sending students to a particular college, where guidance counselors can lobby. A student with a similar profile but no scores from a school that rarely sends graduates to their college will be viewed as a wild card and more and less likely to gain admissions. Admissions officers would take shortcuts and make snap decisions, and their bias would creep into their process more so than they already do. Recommendations are more in-depth and personal for private school applicants who have smaller classes and more opportunity to develop strong relationships with teachers. Standardized testing is an easy scapegoat. Now on to my opponent's case. Standardized tests are best for managing equality. Standardized tests are objective. That's Churchill in 15. Standardized tests assess students based on a similar set of questions, are given under identical. They are provided accurate, unfiltered measure of what a student knows. When students take a standardized exam, a clear view of academic mystery and mastery emerges. Standardized exams provide an objective, summative assessment of student achievement. And standardized tests help level the playing field. That hurt it. That's Acock in 2014, the director of scholar support at Grizzly Prep. Let's look at the purpose standard of tests being standardized. Because not all tests are equal, then we need a common test. Income, race, native language, disability status, and etc. That everyone takes the same test. A standardized test is an equal playing field. When they're graded, no one is looking at income or zip code. Now, you should look at the cross-section. A large majority of the cross-section proves that the affirmative is not able to prove why standardized test is uniquely key or is the unique internal link to mental health issues. Means that other alternative causes such as grade inflation and other things that the affirmative mentioned, such as the differences between socioeconomic status, are the root cause to the affirmative impact, and they cannot resolve it in a world without standardized testing, which is the affirmative. They make arguments about why college degrees are key, but in a world in which we eliminate standardized testing, other things such as grade inflation and the other root causes or alternative causes mentioned above all mean that in a world in which standardized testing doesn't exist, marginalized students don't get access to those degrees, which are key to getting them outside of their mental health issues and poverty and all of the inequalities that marginalized students face in the affirmative case. Lastly, you should look to the piece of evidence that states the comparative analysis between a world without standardized testing and a world with standardized testing. This is our piece of Meltzer evidence. It makes statistical analysis about why socioeconomic status, recommendation, private schools, grade inflation, and other alternative causes actually create the problem, and they only use standardized testing as a scapegoat. Thus, you should vote negative.
Is everyone ready?
Okay, next we have our second crossfire, where the affirmative will be asking negative questions.
Okay, so what particular examples do you have of grade inflation?
Well, our first entire contention mentions grade inflation. It actually does a statistical study over the last 20 years that shows that grades have been rising while the SAT and the ACT have been remaining the same. And that's our first piece of Buckley evidence and our DeBoer evidence, both of those two.
Okay. You seem to be talking about alternative causes and how this is a reason to negate. What I'm wondering is if these causes that you outline exist in both the affirmatives world and the negatives world, isn't this just a question of how standardized tests contribute to these impacts?
While that may be a good question, our argument is that the alternative causes only increase in the affirmative world. I.e., or for example, our argument is that grade inflation increases in a world in which standardized testing doesn't exist. Our argument is that private students will now more likely have access to getting into colleges than marginalized students in a world with or a world without standardized testing. My apologies.
Okay, so why is that true? Eliminating standardized testing, increasing these kind of alternative causes?
Well, our argument is that first of all, without standardized testing, a world in which that exists is other things that replace standardized testing so students can get into college, such as recommendations, which is
okay, sure, that
disproportionately afforded to private schools,
okay.
Admissions, or like guidance counselors, which is disproportionately affected or disproportionately skewed toward private, or people that go to private school and etc.
Okay. Kind of near the end of your speech, you make this argument that we need for the measures to be the same in order to level the playing field. Why does a one-size-fits-all mold necessarily level the playing field?
Well, our argument is that a one-size-fits-all mold means that the tests are no different in one region than the next. But also, too, it actually looks at the core sort of curriculum in schools, which is a universal model that is taught throughout the nation. So we need universal tests that sort of correlate to the universal education models that exist in America. Our argument is that standardized tests is the best way of measuring the sort of universal core that is taught within the education system.
Okay. No further questions? And I will take prep time.
while Brendan is taking some prep time, I'll just explain a couple of things. If you look at the top right of the screen, you'll see that these are actually the speech times throughout a Lincoln-Douglas debate round. So the affirmative constructive is the first speech, and then cross X1, the negative constructive, cross X2. So coming up next are the rebuttals, and you'll notice that there's a first affirmative rebuttal, and later there will also be a second affirmative rebuttal. You might also know that the affirmative has the first speech and the last speech, but that is counteracted in LD by the longer speeches that the negative side has. Although negative only has 2 speeches, those speeches total to be the same amount of time that the 3 speeches the affirmative side has also total. Within the rebuttal speeches, each debater will be attacking the most important arguments made by the other side.
All right, stop prep time, please. All right. For a brief roadmap, I will be addressing my opponent's case and then moving on to defend my own. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So at the top, we agree on the frameworks through which we should evaluate this debate, which is that we should minimize structural violence that students face because of standardized tests or the lack thereof. On my opponent's point about grade inflation, what we need to understand here is that grade inflation does not prove why standardized tests are good or why that's necessarily a reason that you should not vote affirmative. 2 wrongs don't make a right, and whenever they say that this is the only method through which we can solve inequality, that's just not supported by the evidence, which will be shown whenever we get to my case. Now, they go on to talk about how there's more systematic biases in admissions, but these don't actually have to do with standardized tests. They're particularly outside of that, and so those are going to exist whether we have standardized tests or not. This debate is just a question of how standardized tests contribute to systematic bias, which the affirmative is winning, that standardized tests have these biases built in by definition, which means that they make the process worse. Now I'm going to go on to defend my own case. They try to make this point that these tests are objective, when in reality, they're not. It's proven that Black and Latino students perform worse on these tests, and they have also not answered the evidence that I've read about how, in particular, there were questions in which Black and Latino students performed well on, and those questions were deemed invalid, not being objective enough, and they were removed, which proves that certain biases are built into these tests in the first place. Now, they talk about creating a level playing field, but this ignores how one mold fits all does not mean equal opportunity when these biases are already ingrained into the tests. We also need to see the piece of evidence that I read on my first subpoint about how diversity rates increased whenever standardized tests were removed. So statistically, in the context of standardized testing, their point is just not true here. And they say that standardized tests are not key to mental health issues in particular. But yes, I've read evidence in the context of standardized tests that's talking about students that get test anxiety and perform worse on those tests as a result, as well as the mental health issues that these students face as a result of the pressure from standardized tests, which harms their quality of life. My opponent has not answered these particular points, which is a reason to go ahead and vote affirmative. Even if you think that the class disparity debate is a wash because there are other factors involved, you still need to see the fact that there are strong racial biases in standardized tests, and that standardized tests have negative impacts on students whom English is not their first language and have difficulty on some of these particular vocabulary and writing sections. And whenever my opponent talks about alt causes, a very important point here is that these are going to exist in both the affirmative and the negative world. Of course, people are going to have advantages and disadvantages regardless of standardized tests, but the resolution is a question of how standardized tests fits into that. If the affirmative wins that standardized testing makes these impacts worse, then the alt causes are not a reason to vote negative because they need to prove why standardized testing is better than not having standardized testing. And one last point that I would like to make is that my opponent has not addressed the fact that having a college degree increases the quality of life, which the affirmative is able to increase by eliminating standardized testing and increasing the opportunities to which kids can get into college.
I'll be
Darius,
taking.
would you like the rest of your prep time?
Yes.
So you may have noticed that in Brandon's speech just now, he did two main things. One would be to identify key arguments in his opponent's case and attack them. And two would be to extend and develop and defend the strongest points in his own case. Those two things should be in every rebuttal speech, attacking the opponent and defending and building up your own side. You may have also noticed that both debaters saved at least a little bit of their prep time so that they could use it before their final speech.
I'm ready whenever everyone else is. The order will be the negative case and then the affirmative case. Is everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay. Remember, this debate is not about whether or not structural violence is good or bad, because we both agree on the framework that justice is a priority and that structural violence is an unethical thing. But this debate is a question of whether or not eliminating standardized testing actually produces more inequality or solves for inequality. And the negative will win this debate on the premise that eliminating standardized testing actually creates more inequality. The affirmative has said that we have conceded that Black and Latino students perform worse on standardized tests, which is the key argument that they have, and is the only argument that they really extend throughout the entire debate in a way. But the negative has conceded our piece of Meltzer 18 evidence and the warrants coming from this claim that says that no, eliminating standardized testing actually increases systematic bias not only on a class level, which they have no analysis about, they only say this debate is a wash with no warrants, but also on a racialized level. Now here are the warrants. First, that eliminating standardized testing allows for, one, enrollment instability, which leads to early decision, which privileges folks that have a more historical relationship or have more of a relationship with prestigious universities, but secondarily, which privileges students that have guidance counselors, which are only afforded to those that go to private university or privileged high schools, which are not afforded to the marginalized groups, such as Black and Latino students, the affirmative mentions. Secondarily, the affirmative does not also answer the second warrant coming from this piece of evidence that states that the college admissions office will have about 2 times the amount of college applications within their office, and now will have to make rash decisions due to admissions clog within their university, which only leads to more rash decisions, and perceptual bias, which only makes inequality worse. It means that those marginalized groups will not get access to a college degree, and only turns the affirmative case, which means that they only recreate the mental health issues that are present within these marginalized groups in the status quo. Now, finally, I think the argument that they also haven't answered is that this is also based on a racialized bias to where certain groups actually get access to grade inflation, which is the last piece of sort of evidence or warrant that they are not really contesting. Of course, 2 wrongs don't make a right, but our argument is that in a world in which standardized testing doesn't exist, the model for how college admission departments actually sort of go about allowing students within their university is dependent upon grades, is dependent upon recommendation, is dependent upon those who submit their sort of application in early, which only privileges those that are privileged, which means that the affirmative only leads to a net increase in forms of systematic bias, which only the negative resolve. Now, there are a couple of questions that you need to answer so you can sort of get an affirmative ballot. First, does eliminating standardized testing make things worse? The negative has stated, yes, it does. Secondarily, you should think about this question. If the negative is right, that eliminating standardized testing only increases systematic biases by allowing for alternative models to refill or sort of replace the current standardized testing model, you shouldn't eliminate standardized testing. You should reform standardized testing, which resolves a large majority of their arguments about the one-size-fits-all model. If we win a large majority of our arguments that they are true, then it's only a risk that reforming is net better than eliminating. You can go to the affirmatives case. As stated before, The affirmative only has one argument, which is premised on the idea that eliminating standardized testing would actually solve for racialized violence. The negative has proven that this is not true, and actually eliminating standardized testing only privileges those at prestigious high schools and those that have class privilege. Now, our argument is that class privilege and classism outweighs racialized violence. Class privilege is what creates racialized violence, as it is class that determines race, gender, and other sort of ethnic groups and associations with class is because class is based on dividing people, transforming them into commodities, but also, furthermore, is making people into out groups, into in groups. So one group can have a higher status than the other. But also, too, furthermore, that in a world in which class exists, this makes racism inevitable and also exacerbates racism due to all of the sort of warrant that the negative has provided on the negative case. To provide a summary, only in the negative world can we actually solve for forms of structural violence and justice. All of the warrants prove why eliminating standardized testing is problematic, thus you should negate.
All right. I will take the remainder of my prep time.
Okay. The next speech you're about to hear is the final speech of the debate. And then after the debate, we'll open the floor up for questions about the debate.
All right. For a brief roadmap, I will have a framing argument at the top, and then I will address the negatives case, and then I will go on to defend my own case. All right. Everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay. At the top, I think there's a very important framing question to resolve here, and that is that alternative causes are not a reason to vote negative. These other disadvantages are always already going to exist regardless of standardized tests existing. Things like class and racial differences and opportunities. And this means that if the affirmative proves that standardized tests make structural violence worse, then you should vote affirmative in favor of eliminating them. Now, moving on to refute my opponent's case. My opponent makes this argument about how particularly privileged folks have relationships with universities and they also can afford guidance counselors. And these problems exist anyway, but standardized testing makes this inequality worse because of things like elite prep programs for these tests and hiring private tutors. So the same kind of logic can apply, which just means that standardized testing makes the problem worse, and you should vote affirmative to resolve these questions better. And the other point that they bring up is perceptual bias, but there's not actual evidentiary support for this. They have not contended with the fact that diversity rates in college admissions increased whenever they did not evaluate standardized testing as part of the admission requirements. And so the affirmative has statistical proof that diversity is actually increased whenever standardized tests are eliminated. This is a point that has gone unaddressed throughout the debate and should definitely frame your decision whenever it comes down to those particular points, that statistical evidence proves that diversity has been increased in those situations. Now, I would like to move on to defend my own case. At the top here, my opponent makes this argument about how we need to reform standardized tests. You should not evaluate this because this was a new argument in the last speech and there was no warrant or elaboration on this point. The last thing that my opponent says is that class overdetermines race. But this is not applicable in this context because the affirmatives claim is that racial biases are literally built into the tests, like the example of certain test questions being thrown out that Latino and Black students got correct more often than white students did, which just shows how biases are ingrained into the tests. Now, I'm going to go over the two main reasons that you vote affirmative. The first is quality of life. By increasing college opportunities for marginalized students, we're increasing their quality of life because having a degree and having college education influences all of those kind of economic opportunities. And the second is that this puts mental distress on students through standardized tests, which has not been addressed by the negative at all. Thank you.
Thank you both. That concludes our demo debate, and now we'll open everything up for questions and comments. While we give you a minute to type in your questions and comments, first, a very special thank you for Brandon and Darius for being with us and for participating in our first demo debate. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
And second, I'll just say that in a debate like this, if you're at a tournament, of course there will be a debate judge watching and listening to the round. And at the end of that round, the judge has to decide which side was the most persuasive, which side wins. And, you know, in this case, one judge might especially like Brandon's evidence about questions being deemed invalid when Black and Latino students answer them correctly more often than white students. And they might vote for Brandon. But a different judge might be really persuaded by the idea of reforming standardized testing instead of eliminating standardized testing, and they might vote for Darius for that argument. There are a lot of arguments and ideas that came up in the round, and the judge has to choose where they're going to vote and what they think was most persuasive and ultimately what wins the round for them. Okay. Also, I'd like to mention that, especially if this is your first time seeing debate or trying debate, if you enjoyed this debate, we'd love to have you join us for a Saturday workshop for beginner Lincoln Douglas debaters from 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you sign up for that on the Motif debate website, then you'll join me from 1 to 4 p.m. and we'll teach you about the topic, case writing, how to build your arguments, and how to prepare you for a debate. And then after that workshop, you can spend 1 week or so building your own arguments, writing an affirmative case and a negative case. And if you'd like to join us for the debate tournament that's happening on Sunday, September 22nd, then by then, you'll be prepared and ready for that tournament, and that could be your first tournament. Of course, even if you're not a beginner, you're welcome to join us for the tournament. Everyone, all levels and types of LD debaters are welcome. That's Sunday, September 22nd from 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. With that, let's look to the questions. So our first question is, as far as the second negative rebuttal, the 2NR, goes, I noticed Neg extended the idea of admissions clog. I don't understand this warrant. How does eliminating testing lead to an admissions clog? Darius, since that was your evidence, do you want to take that question?
Yes. So the argument is that in a world in which standardized testing doesn't exist, there will be more applicants within college universities or within the college admissions department, or there will be more applications. So the piece of Meltzer 18 evidence does a comparative study that shows that schools that eliminate standardized testing, the application rate drastically increases, which means that admissions officers now have less time to evaluate which application should be ahead, and etc. Our argument was that in a world in which admission clog exists, then admission officers would have less time to make decisions, thus making more rash decisions on who gets in or not. And then the argument is that it leads to more perceptual bias. But that was the warrant from the claim.
To add to that, in just another way of phrasing what's a very similar idea, those standardized testing scores are something that can very quickly put people into a yes pile and a no pile. It's a simple threshold to use, but if you remove the simplest threshold that we can use, the most standardized threshold we can use, then the decision-making process for admissions offices becomes a lot more complex and time-consuming and a lot less clear-cut. So the clog is referring to having more time required to go through those applications and make the decisions that are now not as clear and easy to make. Okay, our next question. How focused should you be on moral arguments versus logical arguments in LD? This topic seems more skewed towards logical arguments. Brandon, do you want to start the answer on this one?
I think part of that may have played out with this particular debate, because in a lot of Lincoln-Douglas debates, the two teams will actually disagree on the frameworks through which you should evaluate the debate. In this debate, we both decided to take up kind of similar ground, reducing structural violence. But in other debates, teams could take different approaches, and they could have different ways of measuring how to evaluate the round through a different moral frame. So I think it just kind of depends. And I think the logical arguments and the moral arguments go hand in hand. I don't think there's really a need to distinguish those.
I definitely agree. And I don't know for all those that are watching or listening and etc. It depends on the framework. So I would definitely agree with Brandon that the sort of that logic and moral they coexist. Especially, for example, like with the content, right? For those that don't know, there is a person that is very popular in Lincoln and Douglas, especially in terms of framework, quote unquote, the father of deontology, and their name is Immanuel Kant. And their argument stemmed from logic, and they use sort of logic to justify morality and reason and intuition and etc. So I think that logic and morality go hand in hand with certain framework. I think it depends on the framework that you're debating.
I agree with both of them. I'll just throw in one more thought. It definitely depends topic to topic which one might be more relevant or prevalent, and it might also depend on the debater you're debating against, but especially it would also depend on what judge you have sitting in front of you in the room. And for example, if you're debating in a Motif debate tournament, before every debate round, you look on the Motif website and find the judge paradigm. A paradigm is something the judge wrote about him or herself, explaining what they look for in debates and how they make their decisions when they're judging a debate. So if you look to that judge paradigm, then you can find, oh, well, this woman is very big on logic and very big on factual evidence. Or you might look at a different paradigm for a different judge and find, oh, well, this judge is very big on morality and wants that to be a big central part of LD. And this judge believes that all LD topics are centered and grounded in morality no matter what. So if you read about your judge from the paradigm, that can also give you some guidance on how to handle the pullback between logic and morality in that debate topic or in that debate round in particular. Okay, next question. Piggybacking on a previous question, I noticed that you guys didn't read any cards on your value and value criterion. Had you guys disagreed, would you have built more heavily on your specific philosophy?
Yes. The simple answer is yes. And Brandon, so what I was also thinking about was reading a utilitarianism framework, and the standard could have been maximizing well-being, and the value can still just be morality. And it would require me reading different pieces of evidence, and it would even change what my negative constructive would look like. So your negative constructive should all tie in to your framework, of course, which is a very, very, of course, simple thing to say, but also very important to mention. And so the simple answer is yes.
One other thing I would say is I think reading evidence on the value and criterion is good if you're trying to make a very specific argument. For example, there are people who see justice differently. Like one person's conception of justice would be different than another philosopher's conception of justice. And that didn't happen in this debate, but there are definitely a lot of different philosophers out there that they disagree on what morality is or what justice is and how they should manifest themselves.
Or they even disagree on the sort of standard on the same morality or on the same values. So say, for example, Kant and Rawls may have disagreements on the standard and maximizing morality, but that doesn't mean that they disagree on the sort of value itself.
For me, as a judge personally, I love to see frameworks where the value and the criterion are backed with cards and with warrants, very clearly supported and explained and laid out. But even if someone doesn't do that within their case, I do think they should have that in their prep. And if it's talked about in cross-ex or useful in a rebuttal, be prepared to bring that in, even if it wasn't in the case itself. So, but I also agree with what Brandon and Darius said 100%. Okay, well, that's our last question for tonight. And again, we want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank Brandon and thank you, Darius, for joining us and debating for everyone tonight. If you're interested in joining Motif for more opportunities in the future, this Saturday we have our workshop from 1 to 4 p.m. You can sign up for that on the motifdebate.com website. And on Saturday, September 22nd, we have the next LD online tournament, which you can also sign up for at motifdebate.com. And for everything else in the future, just follow us on Facebook and keep an eye on our website. Thank you, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us, and have a good night.